The traveler Ibn Battuta had already traveled to Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Oman, China, and India. And on his way back, he went back to his homeland. And from Fez, he decided that he wanted to see the land of the blacks, knowing that they were now Muslim. And he said that he had to travel through Morocco and Al Basra and Tagaza. What's interesting is what he saw when he got there. One of the first things he remarks about is the fact that yes, these people are Muslim, but there's something very different about them. Their treatment of women. He saw something very strange indeed, for back then he saw women arguing with men in the open, women who were in control of male slaves, and men who had friends who were men and even slept in the same room as men who they were not married to. Not only could he not believe this, he decided that it was so bad that in some communities he just never went back. Unfortunately for him, wherever he went in the land of the blacks, this was the situation. Whether he went to Mali, Ethiopia, Persia, and even some parts of Morocco that was still owned by the natives. And he says, the town of Iwalatan is extremely hot. There are few small palms, and they sow melons in their shade. Water comes from underground sources. Mutton is plentiful. Their clothes are of fine quality and Egyptian origin. Most of the inhabitants belong to the Musafa. The women are of outstanding beauty and are more highly regarded than the men. Conditions amongst these people are remarkable, and their lifestyle is strange. The men have no jealousy. No one takes his name from his father, but from his maternal uncle. Sons do not inherit, only sisters' sons. This is something I have seen nowhere in the world except among the infidel Indians of the Mulaibar. Nevertheless, these people are Muslims. They are strict in observing their prayers, studying the religious law, and memorizing the Quran. Their women have no shame before men and do not veil themselves, yet they are punctilious about their prayers. Anyone who wants to take a wife among them does so, but they do not travel with their husbands. And even if one of them wished to, her family would prevent her. Women there have friends and companions among men outside the prohibited degrees of marriage. And in the same way, men have women friends in the same category. A man goes into his house, finds his wife with her man friend, and does not disapprove. One day I called upon the Qadi at Iwalatan. After he had given permission for me to enter, I found him with a young and exceptionally beautiful woman. When I saw her, I hesitated and was going to go back, but she laughed at me and I showed no embarrassment. The Qadi said to me, "Why are you turning back? She is my friend." I was astonished at them, for he was a jurist and a Hajj. I learned that he had asked the Sultan's permission to go on pilgrimage that year with his female companion. I do not know whether this was the one or not, but permission was not granted. One day I called on Abu Muhammad Yandakan al-Musufi, in whose company we had arrived, and found him sitting in a rug. In the middle of the room was a canopied couch, and upon it was a woman with a man sitting and talking together. I said to him, "Who is this woman?" He said, "She is my wife." I said, "What about the man who is with her?" He said, he is her friend. I said, "Are you happy about this? You who have lived in our country and know the content of our religious law?" He said, "The companionship of women and men among us is a good thing and an agreeable practice, which causes no suspicion. They are not like the women of your country." I was astonished at his silliness. I left him and did not visit him again. Afterwards, he invited me a number of times, but I did not accept. Regarding the observations of many travelers, from Vasco da Gama to Bodwick T. Edward, or any traveler in the Muslim world who traveled frequently, which they did, to Africa, this is no surprise or exception. Nearly 500 years later, the author Bodwick T. Edward writes about the fact that the Egyptian woman and the Ashanti woman have this in common, this feeling of being free, to the point where they comment that the men are slaves to the woman. Now, this word slave, he explains, is probably from the fact that women were given right to complain or to talk back or to demand. And they interpret this as slave, especially Christians and Muslims at the time, because to them, a woman should never have this much authority. While scientists in America were busy making up ideas about women being inferior and why they should never leave the house, this is what was happening in Africa. And he says, "The licentious conduct of the woman in Egypt, which was probably characteristic of the higher class only, seems to be preserved in that of the royal family in Ashanti, and the observation of Diodorus that the men were the slaves of the woman may have arisen from the authority still assumed by the women of high rank over their husbands in Abyssinia, and which is carried to such an extreme in Ashanti that the plebeian husband of the king's sister or daughter, for they may marry or intrigue with whom they please, provided he has a fine person, must sacrifice himself on her grave if she dies before him. The importance of the woman has been further exemplified by the kings being unable to take an oath without their sanction. The respect and indulgence observed towards the woman in Ashanti struck me forcibly. After witnessing the contempt and slavery to which they are born in other Negro nations, and led me to accept that the Ashanti were as superior in other respects as I afterwards found them to be.
The cuisine and the lifestyle, because most Tarigs are still very traditionalistic, kind of a bit more conservative. And so, things like owning property, owning goats is very common. But in the Tari culture, actually, our culture is matrilineal. So all of the wealth traces back from the woman, not the man. So my mother, all of the wealth in our family comes from her, not from my dad. And my dad actually took my mother's name, not the other way around. So our culture, the women have a bit more status over the men. So that's something that's very interesting.
The Amazigh, Berbers, and all Berbers' original tradition was very matriarchal. So much so that we have written letters about female warriors fighting wars over in Andalusia, Spain, when they were taking it over. But something more interesting is that the story of Amazons, the female warriors, actually starts in the Iliad, and it depicts African women fighting against many nations. As you can see here, the original Iliad says that the place where you were to find the Amazon was in the Black Sea or even the Libyan Amazon in Libya. Later, these areas would start changing and going from one place to another because this concept caught on. Now, it's easy to think that this story was just some fully made up thing, but as we have read in other parts, that the Iliad was part reality and part fake. In other words, a lot of the places that were used were real places and concepts were real concepts, but a lot of it was just poetry or just fake, attaching goddesses. So it's not surprising that a place where we know there were female warriors, 100%, including the later in the 1600s, I forgot her name, but she was a blonde in that area. Like even when their skin was white or the Arab invasion, they continued to have female warriors. And there's even documentaries you can watch today that talk about how the Arabs of that area work. It's customary for the females to work and not even cover their faces. And that was sorted out in the 60s. But there's still documentaries that you can watch from before that time that shows you how free the women were at that area. Again, similar to all parts. Now in Africa, when it came to stuff like marriage, there was two systems. One was your family chooses them for you, in which some women would be happy to comply because your family wouldn't just choose, an abusive person. And of course, like I've stated, people had rights to leave if things were too abusive. But there's a second system of choosing, which is where a woman presents a man with a gift, and if the man accepts it, they are married. For example, there's a video on YouTube there's videos on YouTube of women proposing to travelers, which some of them take it as a joke, but in reality, in places like Southern Africa, under the Himba and the Zulus and the Xhosas and other people, it was customary for the woman to propose to the man. Under the Zulus, there's something called utu, or any of these other words. That's just one example of the word, where the woman would give a man a ring or a bracelet or a beaded thing that he would wear around his neck. And if he chose her, he would wear that one above all the other women who proposed to him. Now you're thinking, why is he wearing several if he's only going to choose one? Well, Africans have always been polygamist. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, how can they be and also polygamist? Well, it's because women in Africa do the work. And so having one man in your society is okay as long as you have many women. And the woman would beg for more partners because the burden would be lifted off of her. So think about it. If you were married to a man and you were doing all the work, so you're making the house, you're farming, you're taking care of the goats and the children, and you're delivering messages to faraway places, the way you get rid of that burden is you get more wives. And so now, in fact, there's a funny video in Zimbabwe where the oldest woman or the first wife does nothing and she basically just tells all the other wives what to do. This is why in Africa, a lot of women are fully comfortable with polygamy. It is not the same system as anywhere else in the world. It is not a harem.